Hi, everyone. We're going to go ahead and begin. First order of business. First order of business actually is to thank, I think, our director, Richard Grusin, because he did some very nice thanks this morning, and he did not thank himself. And he's a tremendous leader and really the conceptual engine of the Center for 21st Century Studies. So thank you for your leadership and this conference. Yay. The other thing I'd like to do is we had a social media contest called Images of Insecurity, and we had some really great submissions. We promised that we would give you books as prizes, and I'm here to announce the winners of the Signs of Insecurity contest. So we have, I realize now this is quite awkward because I've put the prize books up here and you have to stare the authors in the face as you make your selections. So I didn't mean to do that. We could move the books. I think it, my apologies for creating this little social experiment accidentally. So I also have the winners up here. So if you see your slides up here, your submissions, then you have won a prize. So Sabiha Khan, Tierney Powell, Amy Gaeta, Jess Wilton, Leah Liebeseller, who's our graduate fellow, has also won. This one was hers, the redacted Mueller report, Leah's. And also somebody named J.D. Schnepp, who I believe is actually not at the conference, but submitted something nonetheless. Anyway, if I called your name out and you are here, please feel free to come up and claim a book. They were all generously donated by the plenary speakers, so way to go. No, you should go. Sorry to have made it awkward. Yes, and if there are others who are not here, we will send your books out. So, is someone here? Please come up and claim your book. Okay. Okay. And so we'll just go ahead and begin with the wrap up then, and Richard's going to moderate from over there. So that's all I have.
Moderating moderately. Okay, so the wrap up session is scheduled for an hour and a half like everything else is, but I think this has been such a good conference that I thought we'd take about 3 hours to just make sure that we had said everything that needed to be said. We're down to 3 plenary speakers, so basically we'll go as long as people want to talk, essentially. There's something at the end, closing remarks. I have no closing remarks. So basically, except a thank you, which I will when we run out of steam. But the basic idea of these, and we've done these at some of our conferences, but not at all of them. But they've always been productive, I think. So the basic idea is, I guess, I'm going to reframe the sort of idea of the conference and sort of borrow maybe a little bit from Mark's framing and maybe from some other things that were said very briefly. And then I will invite the last 3 sitting plenaries to say anything that they might have to say. So partly what the rules are, and then it's like thrown open to you. So the rules are you can make comments. I mean, this isn't necessarily a question thing. It's like a discussion, even though spatially it doesn't look that way. So you can get up and talk, or you can ask questions either of individuals or of the panel. I think the idea behind it is to see if there are 2 things. One, if we see there are any kind of either questions or through lines that have emerged that people are interested in highlighting or asking people to talk about, or if maybe, we had question and answers individually for each plenary, but if you wanted to get, plenary speakers in conversation, another thing you might do. If there are things that came up in breakout panels that you want to bring to bear, yes, in relation either to the plenary or in relation to the conference as a whole, that's fine. Pretty much whatever people feel like doing. That's the idea. So what I wanted to just reiterate is that when we came up with the idea of doing this conference on insecurity, my thesis for the introduction was that insecurity is produced by many forms of securitization. But what I really liked about Mark's formulation was the implicit counter thesis that I didn't make clear in my introductory remarks, which is that most forms of security and securitization emerge in response to a claim about insecurity or a claim about crisis or something like that. So that, as Mark, I thought, did a really nice job of laying out, especially historically, that security is often seen as responding to insecurity and as a solution to problems of various kinds of insecurity. And one of the arguments that I wanted to make in putting the CFP here, and I think people responded to this argument, was to flip that and look at the way in which insecurity is not the condition of securitization, but actually the product or result of securitization. Now, of course, of all sorts. If that's the case, well, then you still have insecurity produced by securitization. What do you do with it? And maybe that's something to talk about. So that's kind of really all I wanted to say. And I don't know if anybody wants to pick up on that. Plenarists? I'm going to put this down and somebody can.
Are they traveling around with the mics? Yeah, because there's
Yeah. Yes, if you could start, that would take the plenarist off the hook.
Yes. Glad to do so. So in a number of the breakout sessions, I felt that there were gestures towards ways in which, so insecurity has been produced, now what, right? So, and a lot of times these we can call them strategies of resistance hinged on improvisation, play, different informal strategies of navigating insecurity. So I was wondering if the plenarists could respond to that in terms of, now what?
sure? Yeah, oh yeah. One of my favorite or most memorable observations that I picked up from forensic literature on stalking was that I'm sorry I don't recall the author's name, but it was the observation that stalking victims move, and that's how one learns to live with the experience of stalking. It is to move, but it's to move. Trying to think, move away, move with, and move against. Which I found actually really helpful, right, in terms of thinking about first of all, there's an emphasis there on the capacity to move is actually being really necessary to survival, whatever kind of move you're making, right? And so moving away is the kind of classic, you move your house, change your phone number, that kind of thing. Move against is filing for a temporary restraining order, or engaging the criminal justice, the adversarial model. And moving with is learning to accommodate the situation that you're living in, right? And I'll say one of the things, this is actually something that is manifested in Campus X, Campus Security, but I'm not talking about my own case when I do this. But when I write about this issue, it's having the experience of my sense of privacy, actually removed. And I'd say it took me about 4 days to actually reconcile myself with the fact that that's what had happened. And it was about 4 days of which I felt like I was losing my mind. And then coming into this realization, right, of course I recognize that the sense of privacy that I've lived with and still live with, even as compromised as it is, is that of a very entitled subject in the world, right, who has an enormous amount of privacy relative to, say, for example, someone whose family is being monitored by social services, for example, or child welfare services, just to pick what we would consider a relatively benign example in which one's privacy is completely interpenetrated by the state. So I mean, I'd say the experience gave me a deeper appreciation for the ways in which, like, you know, that in community, you know, in that numbers of people live with very different, like with what we might think of as a stalking relation. Stalking is not quite the right word, but like a surveillance relation, where the sense of being watched and a kind of punitive threat kind of haunting that is actually a part of people's everyday life, and that people actually navigate that, right? Moving away, moving against, and moving with. I found that actually like a very, like, just sort of a very generous model for thinking about what it means to live with what one might call like that kind of like the production of the state of insecurity as a part of your daily life. I keep looking at you because I think the gig economy must have like.
So he must have something he wants to say.
That's just milk, eggs, bread. You know. Are we? Oh, so okay. Let me tell you not a funny story, but a story. So when I started trying to put together the paper that I gave, and I was doing various bits and pieces and thinking and throwing things down in my usual haphazard fashion, I was going to include an outline of the British Library database for books on security and insecurity, in order to do a comparison. And in the end, I didn't, because I couldn't quite make the thing tally exactly. But it was quite interesting, so it generated interesting things. Like, so for example, the first book with insecurity in the title was 1706. There's then a century before the second book is published. And then there's a little flurry of books with insecurity in the title round about the 1810s, 1820s, and then you get a gradual increase. In contrast, there are many more books with security in the title, going back longer, much longer, as I mentioned some of them, and also at any point in the history from whenever the British Library catalogue goes back to, they're always outnumbering books on insecurity. In terms of roughly since 2001, there have been, I might include this in the written version if we ever get this together, right? But there have been some 58,000 books with security in the title published in English, right? And in contrast, there's been around about 1,300 books published with insecurity in the title. So there's far more books being published with insecurity in the title, but there's nowhere near as many books as being published with security in the title. And this has been the case since records began, which I think tells us something. It might tell us a number of things. I'm not really sure. I'm thinking here. I'm going to fall asleep with jet lag in a minute, but I'll keep talking until I finish. I think it tells us something important, which is perhaps what you're trying to capture with your framing, which is that actually security comes first, right? Security is leading the way here, and insecurity is playing catch up, or it's always just following behind, which I think something important hangs on that politically. Second observation that we might want to make about this is that, okay, I don't know how many books there are now with the title Age of Insecurity. I'll try and find out for the written version, right? But I don't doubt that there are books with called The Age of Insecurity. And clearly, given how many other books there are with insecurity in the title, it would be quite reasonable for people to start publishing books called The Age of Insecurity. So maybe this is an age of insecurity, whatever that means. The trouble is, I don't think we know what it means, right? So this points to some interesting things, I think. One is the thing that struck me about this conference, which is that actually, most of the time, most of us weren't talking about insecurity, right? We were talking about things that were connected to insecurities of various sorts, which is partly what made the conference interesting, right? So you send out a call for papers just called Insecurity, and we got a whole range of very different kinds of papers that picked up on a whole range of different types of academic research that are being conducted, which were then in turn picking up on a whole range of what we could now call insecurities. I don't think Age of Insecurity is a great title for a book. I also don't think Age of Insecurity is a great name for whatever age this is. I think there are other names that we have that do just as well. The other thing that struck me about this is that there was a number of things that kept coming up, I thought, just in either explicitly or implicitly. One of them was kind of questions of organization. In particular, universities, because that's where we come from, but more generally, organizations and how they either manage insecurity or actually generate insecurity, and usually both. The second was questions of what we might call mental health. And I don't think we really made enough of, if you like, the politics of mental health. That actually, if there is something going on in relation to insecurity and people's insecurities and how people are living with these insecurities, I think it's important, if we're going to think about insecurity, to think about how mental health is a deeply political thing, and insecurity may be one of the concepts around which that could operate. And I think we kind of haven't. It's just been. I'm just trying to think about what we've been talking about, but somehow not talking about. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, this is like maybe a little bit in that same vein. I was thinking about how one of the things that I've realized over the last couple of days about the usefulness of the category is precisely the way it names both a cause and an effect. Like it names both a kind of affective mood and state of consciousness and kind of ambient emotional atmosphere, and names the process whereby that atmosphere is produced and maintained. So it gets at something that I felt like I was sort of kept coming back to in questions I was asking of panelists was basically about the importance of talking about individual experience and consciousness at the same time that we're talking about structures and systems. And I think that insecurity does that better in a lot of ways than other terms, including terms that I'm very committed to, like exploitation, for instance. It does that better and differently than terms like that do. And I think one of the reasons that I'm interested in that is because I really am increasingly interested in consciousness and in and in trying to push against what I take to be a kind of truism of contemporary Marxist thought in particular, which is that the system of the global totality is impossible to understand, and that it operates behind our backs and without our awareness and in ways that are invisible to us and that we don't see, et cetera, et cetera. And I just am like less and less convinced that that's the case fully. It's not to say that it's not incredibly complicated and that there's not always still things that you learn about it. I mean, I think about Naomi's talk, and I learned things about the system of military outsourcing that I didn't know. But I guess what I mean is something like, when I'm thinking about wages, for instance, and I'm thinking about the difference between a politics like a particular union politics that I'm suggesting is operative in that early 20th century moment, where the demand is for inclusion into a particular kind of system of protection by the state and representation by a union, and something like a correlation between labor and management, that there can be that the difference between the desire to participate in that system as an included member and what's happening now in terms of contemporary labor, where that idea of being included is less and less available to anyone, and thus no longer present as a utopian horizon, and that thus it becomes very obvious if you're, those individual Turkers in those individual rooms, like they can't see each other, so they don't have consciousness in the way that Marx describes consciousness on the factory floor, emerging out of the shared occupation of space. But I think they know crystal fucking clearly what system that they're in and how it's working and how it's using them. Like, I don't think that there's any delusion whatsoever among them about the conditions of their existence and the ways in which they're produced by and determined by structures of hyperexploitation. And I think for me, there is something really useful about the way that Insecurity captures the kind of simultaneity of individual consciousness and awareness and clear-eyed canniness, and also systemic, the sort of total control of a system and a structure, that it captures both of those at once in ways that I find useful and that I think are particularly describe something that I think is changing, has changed about the present, which has to do with this idea of awareness and that like things aren't operating behind our backs; they're right there in front of us. I mean, yeah, I'm a lot less interested in. I mean, I'm interested in the ways that. I mean, I think consciousness is important. So ideology in the other sense, like not as delusion, like ideology as an understanding of a system, right? Produced by, but also in potential antagonism to the system. But I'm just like done with theories of ideology as delusion.
First of all, I'm not an academic, and so I've got to say that sitting through a lot of this, I was quite frankly freaked and feel really insecure. But I'm wondering, as a consequence, what are the responses other than individual or group pushback to individual injuries or group affronts or things of that sort? Richard, in talking about the Lorenzetti fresco, noted the fact that the angel was a woman with breasts and so forth, and of course it was referring to the lady or what she was holding. And I thought, is there something, if we're not falling back on our Christianity and the belief in a future eternity or something like that, is there a politics for the day? Is it feminist? What would be the characteristic of that? And I thought nurturing, caring, and then I thought of a book a little pamphlet I happened across. Who Cares? How to Reshape a Democratic Politics by Joan Tronto. And it was written in 2015, and she wrote another book, Caring Democracy, Markets, Equality, and Justice. And her idea was, rather than finding out in terms of neoliberalism or capitalism or socialism, as we may soon be doing, how about reorienting our whole way of thinking about politics and thinking in terms of a politics that's defined in terms of caring with all its dimensions and beginning to foster thinking about that and respond and actually beginning to create systems or ideas based on that. Now, some people are proposing individual things, but this is a whole different way of looking at the matters as I read what she has to say. And I'm wondering your responses either to something like that, a politics of caring, or what other type of politic or group mass pushback is there to this securitization of our society? Besides resilience, which you weren't happy with.
I can dive into that. I just a little bit. You know, I think it was in the Q&A. I had said I was starting to read, or I've been spending the past couple of years reading work on group dynamics and like group encounter session practices, and also like the work of people we identify as theorists like Felix Guattari, but who's a practicing clinician who's developing ideas about institutions, politics, and groups in practice in like kind of experimental, in a psychiatric hospital in which they're experimenting with the idea of what the structure of a hospital would be. So I've been finding myself turning to work like that, whether that be work in the present, so for example, like the activist text Emergent Strategies, or work that was, essays from the 70s from people who were really kind of doing a rethink with regards to like, it's not just sort of like how we are, but also what we want, right? Insofar as like, on the, passing through like 1968 and a sense of like what the reordering of the world will look like, and then being on the other side, right, of a moment of movement, and then just sort of like questioning like what kind of institution do we want to try to build. I think we have lots of models around for us to actually draw from in histories and like local practices that are actually oriented towards practices of care. Guattari, like, he's working with people who were, institutionalized, right, within where the work is actually like caring within an institution in which actually the patients are involved with caring for each other and caring for the institution. I find that work really kind of inspirational and very like interesting too for thinking about our struggles within university settings insofar as that our the care work that we do gets very segmented and then also often degraded, insofar as like, say, for example, like service-centered kind of works in terms of like the kind of administrative labor that many of us do to support each other, gets like kind of separated out from our research practice, from our teaching practice, from people who are working in terms of the maintenance of the physical space. That there's a segmentation of the work that we do that, and within many universities, especially I would say large ones, we don't, the structures actually really it's like you're going against the path, the flow, if you even try to connect across these differences. I've been reflecting a lot on that in relationship to just sort of, thinking like on a local level, like personally, like what do I want, right, as a professor, right? What do I want from the environment that I'm working in? What I want is to connect more deeply with the people that I work alongside whom I work. And I've been humbled actually by the difficulty of doing that, I'd say. I think that actually challenges even my own ideas about what pulled me into the academy, insofar as it was a way for me to get away from, we were talking about service work earlier, your talk really resonated with me because I was a waitress for a long time, and going into the academy was about getting away from those forms of labor, but actually in those sites it was easier to connect, like with dishwashers, bus people, the owner of the restaurant. It's like a small work environment, and so it was much more dynamic and responsive, unable to actually tolerate, say, for example, super toxic behavior internal to that kind of environment with coworkers because the small business would collapse. But anyway, it's just, I do think we have lots of kind of models and the like, but we have to look and think differently about where we're going to be taking our lessons from. It's a very broad.
So I don't. I think this question of care is a way of asking a different question, which is what should we be thinking about, and what categories do we use to understand the world? And I think the problem is that some people think that saying this is an age of insecurity is a way of describing the world now and somehow describing something different. And my hesitation about that is that actually it's not that different. I have some categories that I use to try and understand the world, and they stem from Marx's work, and they help me make sense of it. So I use exploitation, I use alienation, I use domination. A lot of what I think we're talking about insecurity is precisely what Marx tried to capture with alienation. Right? It's about our separation from each other as human beings. If the question is how do we overcome that, and you want to think about that as care, then yeah, I don't mind that. That's fine. I think there are some good words along those lines. I think the a couple of points for following from that is that I don't. If you can imagine a mass mobilization for something to end the age of insecurity, if it was a mass mobilization in the name of security, it would be even more disastrous than the world we already live in. Right? The last mass mobilization in the name of security was fascism. Right? So that's part of my worry about the cry of insecurity. I think the other thing about that is that this notion of an age of insecurity, which I realise is the one I put on the table, is that in a sense, part of ideology, and I don't necessarily mean it as delusion, but I think you can have a slightly more subtle way of thinking about it. Part of ideology under capitalism is precisely that it generates ways of thinking that make people think differently about the world than through the lens of the critique of political economy, right? So part of my objection to something like resilience is precisely that it encourages the idea that people can take responsibility for their own insecurities, take responsibility for their whatever catastrophe is likely to befall them, whatever emergency is coming their way, whatever the world is like, and be willing to bounce back, right? So bounce back ability is precisely at the core of resilience, which is precisely why it's a deeply conservative concept, right? Because bouncing back is a way of going, well, the world will stay the same. What you just have to do is just adjust slightly, right? This is, reforming in order to conserve, right? And people say, no, well, look, the opposite of resilience is fragility, and you can't surely be on the side of fragility because that would be similar to being on the side of insecurity, and you can't be on that side. Well, actually, I think maybe you can, or you could just go, that's not the language I'm trying to use. The point is the opposite of resilience is not fragility. The opposite of resilience is revolution. Yeah?
So I want to offer a different point of view from that. Yeah, I mean, I'll leave the revolution question hanging, but I think that I do think care and categories are different. And I think that when you start talking about categories, and I think there is this is partly a question of feminism and what we've learned from feminist ways of thinking. And I think that categorical thinking tends to be associated more frequently with patriarchy and with other forms of kinds of more abstract power. And I think that one of the things that I find appealing about the notion of care, but also really not unsatisfying, but worrisome because it takes so damn much care, is that on the one hand, we have these large categories, or even more, large systems that generate in a kind of automatic way forms of insecurity, whether that be, through capitalism, whether that be through industry, whether that be through transportation, through all of our social media, et cetera. Climate insecurity, which is one thing that I had hoped we would have done more with in this conference. We just didn't get as many proposals on that topic. And we've done at C21 climate, explicitly a couple of times. But there are, one of the things about the Anthropocene that interests me is that human agency, the consequences of human agency has become automatized in a kind of structural and systematic way that it operates almost on its own now with all the kinds of consequences that are put in play with global warming and things like that, which you can't just stop. It's not like I can just stop talking or we can turn the lights off. We can't do that with a lot of these systems that are now operative. And that's where care, I think, does come in. And on the one hand, care seems so insufficient because it's so small and local, and it's about two people, or it's about, you and your garden, or care for the environment, or care for, a lake nearby, or whatever, care for a community, for students, and so on. And it's an endless activity, unlike these mindless automatic systems, which are also endless, but which just, keep going and keep generating these consequences. Care is not automatic in that way. It's something very small and local. And I do think that this is part of what we've learned from feminist theory about other ways of being with each other and ways of being with the world. So, revolution is this big, we could imagine, whatever it would be, and that's always the problem, right? It would be some big thing that might stop these systems that are just, constantly reproducing themselves and creating these consequences, these insecurities. But we'd still need a hell of a lot of care if we were to have a revolution of any kind and after that. So I don't know. If any of you want to take this up. Yeah.
So I just have a very brief comment. I wonder.
Wait for the mic.
So I don't necessarily think of care as necessarily small and local, right? And I wonder, I think we can, define capitalism simply as a system predicated on the endless and infinite expansion of private wealth. And I think it would be a revolutionary thing to think about what if we had a social order defined not around that, but on the provision of care. And I think that would be a reasonable starting point for thinking about what a 21st century revolution might look like, right? And, I might point to examples like Rojava or Cooperation Jackson as, a place to look right now.
So I just wanted to ask about two terms that maybe are on the table thinking with feminist theory and queer theory. The first is humor, and something that really struck me, Jennifer, about your talk this morning was how much humor seemed to be a recurrent, it offered us the release out of what was such like a really tense and sorry, I should speak into this more clearly, but that it was so important and essential to the narrative of what was happening and to help us help the feeling of insecurity that I think you were trying to have us feel lay into ourselves, to become an embodied affect. So I wonder if humor and really laughter as a strategy of moving outside of the sort of oppressiveness of security is something we can think about. And the other is in thinking against resilience, how especially Black feminist theory has positioned survival as something that is not exactly about reflexivity or elasticity, but rather about struggle despite the conditions of impossibility or the real disacknowledgement or erasure of existence, as in order to get us to something that has been troubling me a little bit, which is the way that insecurity is used to generalize a whole set of affects and associations to the structure that are differentially distributed across boundaries of race, gender, and class. So when we call out insecurity as in such universalizing strokes, which I think is sort of necessary to the project, I think we are losing the real specificity of what it means to live under the specific conditions of specific kinds of relations to the structure. So if you have any thoughts about those two things.
Yeah, thanks. These have all been really great provocations and questions. I can't remember what of the many of the fantastic keynotes got me thinking about Michael Ballant's work. It's called The Basic Fault, which is a psychoanalytic text that Eve Sedgwick references in her essay on reparative and paranoid reading. I think she references it there briefly, and I think she references it again in her writing and on the weather in Proust. And what I kind of took away from her engagement with that work was that he was writing about the specific forms of fear and anxiety that are kind of manifest around really breakdowns in a kind of infant caretaker relation, something that's kind of prior to another step in socialization, and that in balance work, it's what gets triggered in essence in the interaction with the analyst. And I think he describes it as requiring a regressive form of therapy where you're working out something that's basic to survival, right? It's called kind of a basic fault because it's a basic fault in the structures of relation that are associated not just with like well-being, but actually with survival. And she takes that and plays with it in relationship to, say, for example, like an anxiety disorder, a panic disorder, you can't breathe, right? That sense of not being able to breathe is actually in relationship to a kind of a crisis that's on that level. And I find it interesting that in her work, you know, like in Sedgwick's work, she was like working with paranoia consistently from her dissertation work on on Gothic conventions through Between Men, through epistemology of the closet, and then writes this preparative paranoid essay, you know, which is a really intense theorization of the dominance or like a tendency towards the paranoid position in criticism as something that feels like criticism and also feels like knowing. And she provides a really good critique of that, although I would say it's also kind of partial in a way, and then she kind of lets it go. And Janet Haley wrote an essay contextualizing that turn as a turn that she makes after her diagnosis with cancer, and that there was a need to actually let go of like the paranoid, even paranoia as an object of her analysis. I mean, I wouldn't, I think she was definitely, and she vows this, that paranoid tendency is something that is expressed in much of her work, but like that she lets go of even just paranoia as an object. She doesn't write about paranoia after that essay, right? She turns to actually something like we might call survival poetics, also like pedagogy, which is, a form of care, right? So, I've been finding in kind of a classic set of texts written by Sedgwick, really interesting thought about survival. And this is kind of like another thing that I've been thinking about in other parts of my work is Jose Munoz's work was also about that, right? Disidentification. Like disidentification is a survival strategy, right? Within a context within which like the minoritized subject is placed in an insecure relation to, in essence, all narratives about how the world is organized, right? And he was her student at that time, so I've been kind of hypothesizing in essence that she was actually like learning from him in relationship to like that disidentifications is a reparative project. Actually, I would say it's a kind of classically reparative project, but not often acknowledged as that. So I don't know that goes to your, but I think that there's a lot in queer theory and like kind of what we might think of as some of the roots of queer theory as they've been oriented actually more towards the work of feminists of color, of like anti-racist critique and queer of color critique, and also in like Sedgwick's work with psychoanalysis. I think there's a lot there for thinking actually about living differently with something like a states of insecurity that actually comes from the turn away from the kind of classic like discourse of the closet of like repression and like recovery and those kinds of narratives. I think queer theory kind of had to work out a lot of this stuff around and in the wake of the AIDS crisis, and that we're kind of rediscovering this body of knowledge. So that's only a partial response to there's other stuff in your question.
I don't know if this is like exactly a response, but it's something that I was thinking about a lot during all the conversations about resiliency. And I'm directing the grad program in my department, and you have to write these fellowship applications for all the incoming students. And part of what you have to do is sort of narrate them in a way that is legible to the university administrative class and what it wants to see. And notoriously, what they all want to see right now is grit. Grit. And so there was a moment when I looked at my laptop screen, and I took a screen grab of this to send to my colleague who was DGS the year before, because I knew he would think it was funny, because I realized that on my laptop screen I had 3 tabs open on thesaurus.com, and they were synonyms for perseverance, resilience, and grit, because I was running out of new ways to say this student is perseverant, resilient, and gritty. But then I was sort of thinking about that, and I was thinking about how on the one hand it's doing that kind of narration for the administrative classes like terrible and unbelievably alienating and fucked up, and also has all kinds of bearing on the way that affirmative action is being re-understood by the university today. All of that on the one hand, and on the other hand, being incredibly fucking moved by the stories of some of these students, and like indeed how incredibly, resilient they were or had been, or how incredibly they had survived things that I didn't think that I could ever have survived, right? And so feeling that sort of, I don't know, maybe it's like a moment of genre fail, like feeling that sort of contradiction in that moment and trying to figure out what that meant, right? And then also thinking about the fact that this is part of this my sort of new shtick about consciousness. Like I have students write now in my theory classes, I have them write personal essays about things like their experience as workers, their working life experience, or about their experience with debt. And I have them use their own experience or their experience with police violence. I have them use their experiences as a kind of analytic. And that part of the difference between a language of something like, say, survival, or the language of like imagining that your own experience could be something through which you would teach me as the reader. The difference between that and resilience is that resilience assumes that you have to get past, right? It's a mobility argument. And and just thinking about that, like that what survival suggests maybe, or what the idea that your work experience is a form of knowledge suggests maybe, or what the idea that like this generation of students that I'm teaching do not expect that they will be economically mobile in the way that their parents were. What all of that suggests is this sense of like the sort of not moving past, maybe it's moving with or something, I don't know, but the sense that like those experiences are still there and that they're still fucking you up and that you're also still surviving them and that they're also still part of what you know. Like they're also still part of what makes you, right? And that like that can be true without you, and that you can have not been destroyed by them, but also not have like left them behind somehow. And I think that talking about that is important. And I do think that's particularly important because I think this generation of students that I'm teaching now, I feel like that all they have is the present, because the expectations about the future are not optimistic, their expectations, rightly so. And so I think you have that sense that like all that you have is the thing that you have survived and are continuing to attempt to survive. I don't know.
Back in your court.
I mean, I wanted to also like note, because you spoke a little bit about like how you felt like during the talk, and I one of the things I wanted to say is that it's written very intentionally with the, and you know, like the point is to make people feel that anxiety level. And but one of the things that's like I can't quite figure out how to also communicate like that I feel like that's what the institution was demanding that I feel, right? That in a sense, like, and it was like a really shocking that the LAPD that going to see them, there were things about that were upsetting, because it's like upsetting to be in the position of a victim engaging the criminal justice system. Just, it's like, but you know, that the university apparatus, right? Like that the various people I was encountering were much more comfortable with me in a state of crisis, right? Than they were with me, say, for example, calm and like confident, like I was like, you know, this is what's, you know, because I would toggle back and forth between the two things. I was like, this is what's going to happen. This is what we need to be doing, right? Like this state of agitation, you know, you're amplifying something that's an effect of her behavior, you know, like that was actually hard for them to deal with. What was not hard for them to deal with was me being a mess, right? Me being super anxious, and also like, I think I was saying, and I can't remember, maybe during lunch when I was listening to the audio recording of that hearing, I could hear the pleasure that people were taking, like the sense of excitement that they had in being a part of that story. And that was really, I understand that as like a reader of fiction and, you know, like an avid consumer of stalking narratives, like I understand that, but it was very disturbing when you're like listening to that and it's your own thing, you know, and, you know, so I have a question about my own desire. I want to say it's like I've approached this with ambivalence, but like the own literary project of like creating a narrative that's passing that feeling on to the audience, you know. And I still don't know like whether or not that's a good thing, right? I actually would say that if this is a work in progress, one of the biggest in progressnesses of it is actually like, what is the affective climate that I'm generating through my writing, and why am I doing it, right? Yeah. So I mean, yeah. Just I want to acknowledge that.
I have a general thought about this discussion about resilience. I would suggest that if we were to think in terms of an earlier time, instead of resilience, we might be using the word fortitude. And I would suggest that one of the differences between the two, sorry, one of the differences between the two is that fortitude presumes a kind of oppression, a circumstance where one is a subject, perhaps, a subject of a monarch or someone who's within the boundaries of some other context. And resilience is a little bit different because it presumes that we are these sort of independent existential beings. And I think that that's one of the reasons that resilience has come up and has been part of the, last, 10 or more years of discourse and facing, the challenges that life has been throwing at people. But perhaps the word fortitude also is maybe a happy substitute because it also allows us to think about what courage looks like in a box. And I think that that's part of what the significance, and that's why, for example, the word fortitude replaces courage in the list of the 4 cardinal virtues, right? And that's because, for the ancient Greeks, they were not in the boxes of monarchies in the same way that the medievals were. And so I think that that might be part of the difference. But in the 21st century, in curious sorts of ways, especially, for example, in terms of some of the things you talked about, Annie, people are in boxes, right? And so maybe that's one of the ways that we can talk about the kinds of ability to survive and all of that, but without maybe the hot button word that resilience is in the context of the framework of your understanding. Just a thought.
Sun is shining if people are ready to go and get some air. I think there's no reason we have to sit and wait for last questions or anything like that. I will then say my final remarks, which are, thanks a lot again to staff for doing everything, and I think really just another round of applause. And then just personally, selfishly maybe, thanks to all of you, because, I do these, I come up with these crazy ideas, I guess, and I try to come up with something that seems like people will respond to, and I'm always so nervous when we put these calls for paper out, and nobody's gonna people read this thing and say, what, that's crazy, which is one reason I get a lot of plenary speakers, because I figure, okay, well, this will come to see Mark or to see Annie or to see Sassi, or, whatever, and Jennifer, everybody, whatever. There are people who will be coming for that. So anyway, but thank you, because these are wonderful ways for us to end the year here at C21, and for UWM not to feel, as we sometimes do, isolated in Wisconsin, but to feel connected nationally and internationally. So thanks to all of you, and I think a round of applause.